All right. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Mad Security's Maritime Town Hall series. I'm Cliff Neve, and my objective is to prevent timely and relevant topics in maritime, and also to bring in experts to discuss these topics and the technical, logistical, and yes, even the political considerations around those topics. A good maritime phrase is that a rising tide raises all boats, and with this series, I'm hoping to contribute to that rising tide in a meaningful and collaborative way. Today, I have my good friend Scott Dickerson from CISO LLC, and Scott and I have known each other for over a decade, so it's my pleasure to have him here today. And a little bit about me, for those who don't know me, I'm a retired Coast Guard officer. And to me, maritime cybersecurity isn't just a job, it's a passion. And I know Scott is the same way. When I retired from the Coast Guard, I was acting deputy commander at Coast Guard Cyber Command. And since then, I've continued to work in the cybersecurity field, particularly maritime, where ports, waterways, and commerce are extremely important to me. At this point, I'd like to let Scott introduce himself. So, Scott.
Thanks, Cliff. Happy to be here today. Thank you again for the kind invitation. Always good to be on a session with you talking about all things maritime cybersecurity, and today specifically talking about some of the training requirements. My background is kind of shared there, and for those that might not be familiar with me, then been working on both the public and private sector side for quite a while, focused around maritime cybersecurity, and I think that's enough said about that.
Gotcha. It's great to have you here, Scott. And as Scott mentioned, we're going to be talking about the training piece specifically. And so, just kind of orient everybody to where we are. The Coast Guard final rule in the Marine Transportation System came out and has been in effect since July 16th of this year. The very first domino to fall in this entire rule is the training deadline, and that's why we want to make sure to address it today. And so, they said that the training deadline is January 12th of 2026, and it doesn't end there. It's a continual cycle where it goes annually thereafter. And it does apply to all personnel with access to vessel, facility, or OT systems. And the purpose is, of course, because every person is a part of this maritime cybersecurity system, and every person is a sensor and a potential source of problems, in addition to being a detection of problems within your organization. And in order for to get the maximization of your cyber risk posture, everyone needs to know their roles. And Scott, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I think what the Coast Guard's doing with these new rules, overall, very good. Raising that bar, like you were saying at the very beginning, high tides raise all ships. So if everybody knows a little bit more about cybersecurity, whether they're working in IT or OT environments, that should help everybody be a little bit more resilient when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber attacks. So that is very good. I think as we go through here and talk through today about what some of the requirements are, there are some challenges that organizations are going to have to think through about how do they meet those requirements then. And so we'll dive into those as we go through, I think.
Awesome. Excellent. Appreciate the color on that. And as far as what the rule says, who must be trained? So it must be provided to all personnel with access to IT and OT systems, but also there has to be role-based access for personnel with cyber-related duties. And the CISO is certainly the key role, the key element of the cybersecurity program within covered entities. And so the CISO and other key personnel must receive specialized and annual training. And then new hires must be trained within 60 days of cybersecurity plan approval. And for some organizations, this can be logistically challenging. You may have folks that are union employees, you may have folks that are remote, et cetera. So logistically, having a plan to how you're going to cover these folks is going to be critical. And I know, Scott, you've got some thoughts on personnel and having worked at several shipping yards, shipping lines. You have some thoughts on personnel and some of the challenges there.
Yeah, and so part of this goes also, there's a little bit more devil in the details there with the Coast Guard rules, where it's like, okay, within 30 days of being hired on, then you have to complete the training, or within like 5 days of gaining system access. So again, for these roles, if it's a union worker, that might be somebody who shows up into a port environment and might not necessarily know where they're going to be assigned to work that week, to which terminal operator. If you've been to one port, you've been to one port, and they all work a little bit differently. And so from that perspective, how is somebody who is going to different owners and operators throughout the course of a year, how are they going to show verification of their training to a different terminal operator? Because this isn't on the personnel. What the Coast Guard has said is it's really on the facility or the vessel, on their responsibility of the owner and operator to make sure everybody's trained. So again, if they're having rotating personnel come in and out, that's a lot of tracking. That's a lot of overhead work that needs to be done. And so thinking through, how do you present that training? Okay, not everybody's going to have a user account. So my LMS system, my learning management system that I might use normally for training, wow, that might be a real hurdle to try to overcome if I want to just upload training to that and have everybody do that might be in these other positions. So thinking through not just the content of the training, but how is that going to be delivered to everybody becomes key. Can it be printed out in a standalone binder where it's like, okay, if you're a vendor coming in, we just found out that you're coming in today and you're going to be doing work on an OT system. Maybe it's a manual OT system. It might not even be networked. According to this rule, you still need to do this training. So how do those personnel do that? Okay, do you have a hard copy of training materials that somebody could look through, sign off on, etc.? Do you have a standalone training kiosk then that people could use? And maybe that has digital material on a video, etc. Is the material actually tailored to your environment? Okay, key personnel, what does that mean for your environment? Who needs to exactly do that training? Who are you requiring that of? That's not necessarily very clearly specified. What Cliff has there is about as detailed as it gets from the Coast Guard's key personnel. Okay, is that, from a vessel perspective, is that the senior officers only? Is that anybody that has a watchstander duty on board the ship that might not just include the senior officers, right? From a shoreside perspective, is that just the general manager, some of the management team, or is that also the crane operator being somebody that, that could be a key person? That's major equipment that is operational and obviously very key in a lot of container terminals. Same thing from if you look over to different environments of a cruise line facility, shoreside, is that everybody does key personnel include anybody that's helping check passenger details when they're coming on, because that's critical and has PII information available, credit card information, etc. Where's that line drawn for your organization? Understanding that and how that training is going to be provided, I think, is key.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is that this training piece, it seems like this would be the simplest piece, right? And it is a relatively simple piece, but it also gives you a view in the microcosm of why maritime cybersecurity is so hard. And I think you start looking at, you have multiple people who are sometimes temporary coming into systems that are moving around. And how do you account for it all? And I think that where the Coast Guard's going, because they can't be overly prescriptive, because once you've seen one terminal, you've seen one terminal. And so I think a lot of this falls on the CISO's shoulders to develop something that is meaningful and is satisfactory and meets the risk posture for appropriately for their facility that they're overseeing. And I believe that the Coast Guard doesn't have the people to go through and check every individual thing. So they're going to have to rely very heavily on the CISO, including training, right? And so as the CISO develops the rules for the training, and hopefully those people have been identified, even though that's not required until after the fact. Hopefully they're including folks that are knowledgeable about these systems and potentially will become the CISOs for these planning activities. And so if, as folks plan this, this kind of helps also shape the foundation for future requirements that are coming along. And how are we going to meet these demands given our port or our ships or our cranes or whatever, what other factors come into place? It's going to have to be very individually based and customized port to port. But the CISO is going to have to defend why they did what they did. And so if you didn't train certain people in certain ways, or you did train them in certain ways, that needs to be a deliberate decision that you did, taking into account all the cyber risks. All right. And then, so some of the specifics that are covered are, what kind of training must be covered, the topics. One is recognition, detection of cybersecurity threats. And, we've seen several exercises and modulations and simulations where, for example, the University of Plymouth just recently worked with the Coast Guard and did some modeling and simulation where, something might happen on the bridge of a ship and you're not sure if it's a cybersecurity incident or not, right? So how do you determine whether something is or isn't a cybersecurity incident, or whether it's just a power outage or something going on the ship? So, recognition and detection of those threats, and who you tell, right? Do you just, do you have a culture where people go, that's odd, and turn around and walk away? Or do you have a culture where people know who they can call and under what circumstances they should call them to check it out? And then the techniques used to circumvent cybersecurity measures. In order to defend, you have to understand how offense works. It's that simple. And that's why the MITRE ATT&CK framework is such a powerful tool, because those are all the different ways that somebody can hack in. So understanding the physical and cybersecurity measures that folks use to bypass systems is critical. Procedures for reporting cybersecurity incidents, and that's a session all on its own, for the most part, about when you do and when you don't report things up the chain to the NRC. And then specialized training for key personnel based on roles and responsibilities. So Scott, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, all of these areas then beg a lot of questions in and of themselves. Are you really concerned about who the threat actor is? Yes, no, maybe. You're not necessarily going to know when an attack is happening and be able to attribute who it is, but are you providing awareness about some of the common threat actor types? Because that can help somebody kind of determine and think through, oh, what might be going on here? And it depends on what role they play and all that. So recognizing and detecting cybersecurity threats is going to be very different for somebody who's inside of a fence line or on board a vessel. Those are going to be very different things. And especially, it can even be somebody inside of a fence line that might be regulated, but they might not have anything to do necessarily from an operations technology perspective. So OT perspectives, or what's going on in a terminal, etc. It could be somebody who's in the finance department. How they might detect a cybersecurity threat is going to be very different from somebody who's working on a crane, for example. We'll go back to that example. Those are different threat actor types that might be targeting them. There's going to be different techniques and tactics that are used. So how they would detect is going to be very different. And so are you incorporating that range of information into your training materials and how you're presenting it to everybody, where people from very different work groups might relate to that information in very different ways and need to detect things in very different ways? So this becomes not just an easy check the box type of exercise. It needs to be well thought through to have it be meaningful for the people that are receiving the training. Otherwise it might be too generic and they're just like, I still don't know what I'm going to do and how I would recognize and detect a threat. Same thing for techniques to circumvent. Okay. If you're somebody that's handling USBs, well, there's threat actor groups that are actively leveraging USB devices in the maritime sector to carry out their attacks. But again, if you're in the finance department, you might not be using USBs ever, but social engineering and phishing schemes are going to be what is more likely what you're going to encounter. So all these different aspects, it really adds some layers of complexity to the training and how to walk through things and how to explain it all.
Well put. And I think that for financial folks, you get business email compromises and things like that, right? Where they get targeted, and the rise of that has been tremendous and still persists. And a lot of this goes to, Simon Sinek's, start with why. Why should your people care about this? And this is not just a check the box thing. This is something that impacts the business. And I think that you know, hopefully our audience is mostly the cybersecurity folks that are setting this up, they had better buy in, right? That's the first line of folks that buy in of why what we do is important to the business, to our nation, and to ourselves. Because you get a ransomware hit, you might not be getting that raise or bonus. And so I think that this impacts all of us, personally, as well as the organization, as well as the mission. And so I think that what you said there, Scott, is very well put, of tailoring it to the different people on our staffs, what they're probably going to encounter, and the people of why would this group of people be interested in attacking us, whether that be for monetary gain, whether it be for competitive advantage, whether that be for nation state intelligence, like we've seen with Volt and Salt Typhoon, etc. Awesome. And no training program with me escapes without me addressing the fog behavior model. I think because it's such an awesome model for telling you why training works and why systems must be designed simply, and how we need to be able to make it as simple as possible for our people, and to do policies and procedures not with security in mind solely, but also with the reality of being able to do it. And really what this model says is that does the person understand the why? And if they understand the why, they're willing to go through some additional steps, and they understand the value of following the processes and policies. And so the more that they understand, the more motivation they have, the more likely they are to do it. But then you have this other piece, which is how hard is it to do? Because there will be procedures and processes that even your most motivated members just aren't going to endure. They're going to bypass them for the ease of doing their job if they are too hard. And we've seen this happen actually in practice, where someone will over protect a network. They'll make security so hard that people start finding workarounds, or will set up what's called shadow IT, their own way of getting into systems and getting the data they need. So this all has to be balanced with, it needs to be as easy as possible to do. The people have to be motivated as highly as possible to do it, and then they have to be triggered into conducting that action that they're supposed to conduct. And one of the more telling things is that Mad Security, we conducted a phishing campaign, and what we found was that of those people who opened their email quickly, 78% ended up clicking on the phishing link. It was a very well engineered link, and it was a very tricky fish. But what we found was that those who process email quickly, they weren't being triggered. They were just processing. And so that would indicate that employees are conditioned to process email quickly. There's no effective trigger that governs their security towards tactics. So you can use that to tell people, hey, look, slow down. Think before you click. Scott?
And depending on the position, that becomes really challenging, right? If I'm, again, at a regulated facility, maybe I'm customer service oriented, very much so. Like I'm trying to process and help, whether it's truckers, whether it's passengers, whoever it might be, get in and out in an efficient manner, an effective manner. And there might be, 1,000 different stakeholders and third parties that we interact with. And so there's emails coming from all kinds of different domains. So, okay, I've got a banner in my email that says this is from an external email. Yeah, that's like 99% of the emails I personally receive is from there. It's not internal within my organization. It's all from external sources. Okay, so some of those things that might be used from a social engineering, email security perspective might have less meaning. And so, okay, I'm getting a link from X domain. Yeah, I get those regularly. Okay, well, this time that third party was compromised. Threat actor used that domain that I do recognize and do know, but it's business email compromise situation, like you mentioned earlier. And now I click on that link and something's going on. So this can add up. In other areas, it's like, okay, I don't even get email. I don't use email because I'm out in the yard and everything that I do, I'm driving around a tractor and moving container from this location A to location B, unloading, offloading. I'm not necessarily in there. And so again, it goes all the way back to the training and who the target audience is, how do they interact with the systems, what systems do they leverage and use. All this just adds a lot of complexity to it. And as your fog model you point out to, like, okay, well, you're in position A and I've just made it a laborious process for you to do anything. Well, okay, either I'm going to come up with some shortcuts, and whether that's shadow IT, is that nowadays more shadow AI that is going to come into play, and I'm using that, I'm leveraging generative AI tools to do my job, and the organization has said no, we're not using that, but it helps me out, so I have a personal account and I'm using sensitive information on there. Like, there's all different ways from a cybersecurity perspective that those triggers may or may not work well based on what hurdles we've put in the way. So making it that key part of that, okay, are they motivated? Do they understand? And then that ability, can they actually do it, or are they just going to bypass this because it's so hard? And I think, talking through the triggers, then it's like, okay, do they have the right information at the right time to get the right action? And okay, if this is an annual training, what else is happening in the intermediate time? And while we're focused on the training aspects of things today, that's where some of the drills and exercises also come in throughout the year to hopefully help prompt things. Do you also have other methodologies for sharing information? Is that visible posters that are up with reminders about clicking on links and how to process and look at ways to detect a phishing email, for example, how to handle a USB drive, etc. Those types of things can provide that trigger. It's like, man, I walk by that poster every day, and subconsciously, I'm not necessarily looking at all the details on it anymore, but I pass by, I know this poster's there, and I know what it's saying, and that is subconsciously triggering me to think about this a little bit more when I have it. Perhaps all those things come into play, I think.
Awesome. Excellent. Well put. And so as far as the training piece of this, right, which is we're here to talk about today, and what the Coast Guard's saying of, training helps with the why and it helps with the ability as well. So what are your thoughts on training in general, and what kind of training would make a good training in the port environment?
So I think, one, the training needs to be relevant. Let's start there. So, and I think that goes to your point here in the fog model is, does that help with my motivation? Do I understand, why these threat actors might be targeting, how that could play out in terms of an impact from an operational or organizational perspective, understanding what that could do to me in my position, all those things that can help be relevant to me, then I'm going to understand it better. If it's a very generic training that doesn't necessarily even help with maritime context, and it's something from a training provider that goes to every industry and everyone out there, it might be a little more difficult for people to relate to. So from that perspective, while the context of the training material might be accurate, it might be good, does it lead to high motivation, or is it still lower motivation because I just don't get what the relevancy of it is to me, how it can impact our organization? So I think the context and making it maritime specific, I think that's a key thing. Again, when it comes to some of the different roles that are required to have this training and the personnel that are moving around and the complexity of all that. If you can make it a little bit more relatable from that perspective, I think that also is really key in how you look through things. And so we could look at some examples if you want now, Cliff, or if there's something
Yeah,
else
that'd
you
be
want to
great.
cover here,
No, I
then we
would
can
love
do
to.
that.
Yeah, let's go ahead
Okay.
and take it away.
So I'll request control, and then I can pull up a couple of different materials here.
Give control. And I think you're exactly correct. Context matters. And, whether you're maritime, whether you're law, whether you're, defense industrial base, that context is so critical for giving people the why.
And so if we, there's been some training that says LLC that I've developed to meet these requirements, because it's like, okay, does everybody have something that they could use? So we've developed some materials, and I'll just walk through a few examples of some of the slides. We've done we've specifically used a PowerPoint format where then this could be downloaded as needed. It can be customized to a specific regulated entity. So whether that's a ship operator, whether that's a terminal operator, whether that's a port authority, all those types are actively using this training. And so I think that speaks to that this is resonating with some of those various stakeholder types, that this can be relevant for them. They're tailoring it for their needs, their environments, which not all training materials you can do. So I think that becomes very helpful from their perspective. It might not be the greatest business model from a lot of training perspectives that want to just have a subscription-based model. We're really aiming at something that can be usable and friendly for the community. So now I'll go through and walk through a couple of these things, but
Please.
it's like, so one of the things that the Coast Guard doesn't necessarily say, if you just look at what is needed from the Coast Guard final rules, you might not necessarily think of setting up the context for it and really laying out and understanding some of the basics behind the training and what are some of those baseline understanding of things. So are you going through and explaining what's the difference between IT security and OT security? How are those systems different? What are the different things? And highlighting that, providing a voiceover video and really speaking to some of those things, I think is important. Laying out all the different areas of a cybersecurity plan that might need to come into play, how do all those interact? Are you walking through those different areas and helping people understand what the organization is doing, not just from a technology perspective of how are we keeping these systems safe, but the policies and procedures that people need to be aware of. Are you even explaining that? How the training should be recorded and documented? Because maybe there's a person that's taking this training that is their specific role and where they come into play into this. Some of the technical controls that people might not be aware of up front, but might be happening in the background. And so if they see something suspicious, letting somebody else know, letting the CISO know, that then they can look in through the technical piece of things and see, oh, do I have any indicators elsewhere that something might be going on? And again, reinforcing training drills, exercise, all those types of things could be covered within these plans. Are you talking about different types of threats? So one, as I mentioned earlier, the threat actors, but then are you going through and talking through what are some of the various types of threats that they might see? What are some of the attack techniques specifically for OT systems that people might see and come across? And some of that depends on how the environment has been set up. Again, you look down the list, phishing attacks. Well, OT, I'm not using email on my OT systems, but if there's not network segmentation that's been set up and put in place and you have a very flat network, how threat actors are getting to those OT environments is often through phishing attacks. So while I may not be working on the OT side of the house and I'm working on my IT systems, am I aware that my actions on the IT side could impact the OT side when I click on that link and allow that threat actor in the door? And now it's on our operations saying, I did that. Oh, wow. Like the impact that I could have on the organization, that understanding changes that motivation, as we were talking about earlier. And then going through and talking about how are these threats evolving over time. The AI capabilities, the deepfake capabilities, expanding infrastructure, all these different types of things should be talked about. So sneak peek and sneak preview there of that. But I think all those types of things are materials that can be used in this type of training that the Coast Guard's requiring. Again, can raise all ships with the higher tides, right? If everybody's kind of going through and thinking through some of these aspects of things.
Absolutely. And I think that it's important, that the developers of the training, and that the training be grounded in the truth of what's practical and what's out there. Right. And so, some of us have been in this community for decades now, and understand, the differences between what a non-maritime community type of training might provide versus and what they're missing, what they're leaving out. And we got a couple of questions that had popped up in the chat. One of them was about how to hit those temporary people. And I think that you had talked about that, but they're asking for a little bit more clarity on how can you do that. I think you talked about like downloading and making it available via print, maybe.
Yeah, and so I think there's multiple different ways that can happen, particularly for those temporary, and whether that's a part-time person that might be a temporary seasonal worker, whether that could be a union worker, a vendor, etc., that might just temporarily be on site. And so again, I think there's multiple ways, and each organization is their own kind of organized chaos, if you will, of how can they do it? Okay. Can we actually set them up with an account to an LMS where then they can manage that? Do I go through a third party? And so, I'm trying to think through how we're kind of approaching this. So one is, okay, is it possible to have download copies of the material with all of the notes and printouts where then people can kind of read through, and it's not just a picture on a slide, but they actually have the context and can read through that, more or less the script, and absorb the training in that way. There's some organizations that might have to, they're going to have to leverage that type of effort. Somebody, think about a ship that is temporarily in port, and there's a vendor that needs to come on to perform X maintenance. Okay, they're supposed to have this training. Okay, that ship's temporarily there. So to gain access to it, do they have to go through a binder and then sign off on something? And then does the ship track that as part of their training records? Like, yep, these are all the people that have come on. We have, so if the Coast Guard comes and does an inspection, it's like, okay, let me see your sign-in log. Okay, let me see your training log. Did all those people that came on and had access to some of these systems, does it match? So that could be a way where it's like, okay, here's our training records, and here's our visitor logs. Boom, you can kind of match those up one for one. Do you enter those into other systems? Again, there's ways to do that. One of the other options that we thought through and what we're offering is we have periodic sessions set up for the training where somebody can attend, just like they're attending this webinar, attend that. We have their training information, everything, and they could be like, okay, you have my training record. I'm going to be at different areas. I might go to multiple terminals in this port or different ports or whatever. Well, then that's a way, but this is still going to be difficult for organizations, right? But then are there training providers that are willing to then say, oh, you want a list of, did X receive training? Okay, we can look through the records and more or less then we have the LMS to be able to look through and say, okay, yep, we have a training record for this person. Yes, it was 6 months ago. And yeah, they've been working at that other terminal. And now they're switching over. They've got a new job or whatever. Yeah, they don't have to do training right away. They have completed that for this year. And then next year they need to recomplete their annual training. So that could be a way where training providers can help the maritime sector in really understanding what those challenges are and provide solutions that then can help meet their needs. So somebody could attend online training, get credit for it, and be able to also then, we're providing certificates to those end users so that user could then say, okay, they can show up to the site and be like, okay, here's my training certificate. I've done the training. It's been approved. Look at the date. So, it's multiple avenues. Can the organization check? Can the user provide some sort of certification that they have completed that training, etc.? It's not going to be a perfect system all the way around. But again, with these part-time and temporary workers and everything, that's really where the challenge comes in. I think it's a lot easier if you have a full-time employee. Okay, you've got your LMS, you've got this, that, and the other. There's ways to track that. It's really the temporaries that are going to be challenging for the sector as a whole, in my opinion.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And, I think also that, I'm hopeful that the community will share information as they go, right? And that the lessons that get learned in one terminal can be applied to others. And a lot of times the best way for that to happen is by word of mouth via consultants who are consulting with multiple ones, right? Like, hey, I've seen this problem before. I've seen this challenge before. And here's how they solved it. And then, getting better best practices codified. And I believe wholeheartedly that where the Coast Guard is they're looking at folks to make a good effort and to do the best they can with what they have. The maritime environment is suboptimal for this, and so we know that there's always union considerations, right? There's going to be pushback in many cases on doing that, and so I think that so long as the CISO is deliberate and about trying to do the right thing and get the right people certified and mitigate. If you have folks coming on and it's not feasible for them to have taken the training, are they going to be escorted by somebody who is maybe a higher level of cybersecurity? Instead of just having a run-of-the-mill person escort them, do you have somebody from the IT group or from the security group who is going to be paying closer attention to that as an escort to mitigate and offset? And I think that in those cases, if that's documented as a process, that might be reasonable for those folks where it's just not feasible.
And I think that's
Love
a
it.
great point because that comes up into where the rules state that, like, okay, if you haven't gotten this training, you need to be escorted. And so that was a great point, Cliff, to make, that it's like, okay, that's another way to deal with this challenge is, okay, maybe we're not going to give training to everybody. But again, that becomes difficult for some of those temporary roles. They have to have, you more or less can't have escorted access. You're going to have to double your manpower, maybe not double it, but there's going to be an X factor to it to be able to escort everybody around if they haven't received the training, because you could have numerous temporary people on a given day from the union supporting that. So that becomes challenging, but yeah, it is an option.
Awesome. And as far as group trainings and things like that, what are your thoughts on people like the mix between, something that's online asynchronous and then something where folks might be together to talk through scenarios and things like that? What kind of mix might be a good one for holistic training for this?
Yeah, so I know that there's some organizations that are definitely going to do that, especially from a vessel perspective, right? Okay, let's show this video, and the master's going to track or designate somebody amongst the senior officers to then verify the training was completed by the crew on this date. Everybody signs in, and then that gets signed off on by one of the senior officers. But then that becomes a way to pull everybody together to say, okay, we're going to play this video of the training, and they receive the training in that format. I think that's definitely a way that's going to be used.
Perfect. Any other final thoughts? I know that you've got this, you have a solution that's out there, and I had the chance to kind of QA it, and was honored to do so, and thought it was absolutely tremendous. So, how can people reach out to you? Within my group of folks, Mad Security is kind of like the security operations and those kinds of things. You're the go-to person that I send folks to for training and big picture consulting and those kinds of things. What's a good way to reach you?
So first off, I gotta say, appreciate that, Cliff. Always appreciate that resource and your friendship and collaboration on all those things. So if you know Cliff and want to reach out to Cliff and really say that, he knows how to get in touch with me. If you want to reach out to me directly, scott.dickerson@ciso, CISOLLC.us is the email address to do that. You can find me on LinkedIn under Scott Dickerson and CISO LLC. Lots of different ways that you could reach out and get in touch. So either through Cliff, either to me directly. And as part of the, I think we give a shout out to our collective Global Maritime Cybersecurity Consortium, the GMCC, where, everybody's got kind of their niche areas that they operate in. And so when some of these things come up, like somebody comes to me and is like, hey, do you know anybody that's doing maritime SOC? Yeah, I really do. And that's their focus area. And so then Cliff definitely finds out about those folks. And so I think the way that we can help benefit the community is by, everybody's got different areas and different expertise areas, because cyber is getting very much a broad spectrum area, and you can't be a specialist in everything. So that collaboration and references is great.
Awesome. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much for your time, Scott. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for everybody who joined us today. And we'll be recording this as well and getting it out for anybody who may have registered and missed it. But appreciate your time as always. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you, Cliff. Really appreciate it. Everybody take care. Bye.
Cheers.